Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to the webinar. I hope you're all well and surviving these very strange times. It's been only a month or so since the last webinar, and the world has shifted on its axis. So I'll be looking to cover, obviously, the situation in Ukraine, as well as the second part of the kind of somewhat cheery topic, the collapse of Western civilization, part 2. I did not, I have to confess, expect it to happen so quickly after part 1. This time, how the Fed broke the economy. And we'll get back into that in just a second. Let's start with, obviously, the very serious matter, what's happening in Ukraine and Russia. And in a sense, this slide sums up what is a very, very sad situation with many, many civilian casualties. I think 1,000 is the estimate of civilian casualties so far in Ukraine. And the war is almost into its second month. And I wanted to give you an update in terms of where we are in the war, kind of right up to date, using a map. This shows areas of Russian control in red and likely routes further into Ukraine and into Kiev. But you'll note, eagle eyes amongst you, that this is actually day 4, not day 29. And the day 29 map would look exactly the same as the day 4 map. The Russians have made very, very little progress. And as we speak, it looks like the invasion has stalled. They failed to take Kiev or really any other meaningful city. And what we thought they might want to do going into this is to retain, if you look on the right of that map, the two separatist-held kind of Russian-controlled areas of Luhansk and Donetsk, and link those across the southern coast to, in a sense, ransom strip the rest of Ukraine and block the rest of Ukraine away from its trade routes through the Black Sea and over Crimea, which of course is annexed by Russia already. And they've so far failed to control that southern area. And the port of Mariupol towards the right there has been, the latest pictures show it's been completely destroyed, but still not taken. And if they were able to control that, then they could, withdraw and retain those Russian-held areas. But right now, it looks like it's stalled, and it's worth looking at why this started, in a sense, in the first place. And I have to say, the West did renege on a pledge not to move NATO forces to the Russian border, and they have actually done exactly that. This map in kind of darkish blue is our NATO countries. And you will note that it's mostly NATO countries, including Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania at the top there, not Ukraine. And Ukraine has de facto said they won't join NATO now. Moldova is the one just next to Ukraine, which is not a NATO member, but all the others are. And Russia, I think, is very unlikely will take on a member of NATO. Because Article 6 says that if you attack a NATO member, then you attack NATO, and we are in World War III time. But you can see the battle groups, and they're moving more battle groups into those areas as we speak. That was announced overnight. So NATO has moved to the east and is threatening Russia, and Russia said, enough, we're pushing back, and we're pushing into Ukraine, which is always in their minds be part of Russia. And President Putin has been very clear on that, in terms of why he's gone into this particular conflict. And this has all meant, of course, that we are right now, this is a somewhat startling slide I have to put in, rising risk of a nuclear apocalypse. This is the Google searches for Russian nuclear weapons, which, as you imagine, has gone through the roof. I was in London 3 weeks ago when this broke, and it's a nervous time when you have a nuclear weapon pointed at you with the safety catch off. Not pleasant. That remains there as a potential threat. And part of what the West is worried about is this part of the map. I talked about Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania on the top left, northwest of Russia, or west of Russia, and Finland's on the northwest. And you can see here, if you look closely, you have Russia, Belarus, which is effectively Russian-controlled, and then something called the Suwalki Gap, which I didn't know about, which goes through Lithuania and links to another part of Russia called Kaliningrad, which again, I didn't know was there, quite honestly. And if you link those two things up, you basically partition Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, and the West is concerned that, as NATO members, Russia may be interested in those next. I actually think that's unlikely, and it's unlikely for a couple of reasons. And I think Putin now is realizing that he has overreached, and I don't think he can control. I don't think he can conquer, let alone control Ukraine. And the Ukraine fighters are, as we speak, battling back hard, in fact, and pushing the Russians back. And I don't think the Russian military is the force it was. And I think that's becoming apparent to Putin. So he's looking to negotiate a settlement, is my view, which means we hopefully will get an end to this war perhaps sooner rather than later. The other reason of overreach is this chart, which shows you GDP of countries globally. Blue is kind of North America, red is Asia, green is Europe, including Russia on this chart. And you'd be hard-pressed to find Russia. It took me a while to find it. So Russia is kind of at 4 o'clock on the clock there, so bottom-ish right. Russia, GDP, $1.65 trillion. That's just about the size of Spain. I mean, Russia's just too small to wage these wars. So he's got a big army, but he doesn't have the economic wherewithal to do it. That's point number one. Point number two of overreach would be this quote from Dan Rather, who used to be on CNN. What is the total number of people in this world that actually want this war? And that number, of course, is 1, which is President Putin. And he is facing increasing dissent at home. And that's a risk for him. The longer this goes on, the greater that dissent comes through, particularly in young people who don't want this. They're very westernized. It's not like the old USSR where everyone was compliant. And we're even seeing it on Russia TV. And we would have been able to see that if we were able to see Russia Today as a channel. The UK banned Russia Today. So you've got CNN, Fox, Al Jazeera, Russia Today, etc. Russia Today you can no longer get in South Africa or in the UK, or probably across the West. We're blocked from watching it, and you can't get it online either. I've tried. So we can't get the other side of this propaganda war, which is also going on between the West and the East. But nevertheless, this is Russian TV. It is state-controlled. And in the background is the producer of Russia Today. And the text in Russian says, "Stop the war, don't believe the propaganda, you are being lied to." She held this up live on Russian TV, state-controlled TV. She has kind of disappeared after this. But dissent is there. To have that Russian TV state-controlled is really quite extraordinary. And the last thing, of course, is sanctions. I've been very surprised. I'll pause the slides for a second. I've been very surprised at the extent of the response of the West to sanctions. And I think the West kind of realized this was kind of a line in the sand. We talked last time about the expansion of the East, Russia, China, Iran, and the encroachment on the West. And this move by Putin, I think the West has said, okay, this is the line in the sand. And the sanctions response has been pretty extreme. I think partly, and quite effective actually, probably, and partly the response has been strong because it's a CNN war. So it's awful and dreadful, and one never wants to see it, but the war is in our faces all the time. And the West has one voice, which is the Twitter voice, which we talked about last time, and that voice is very vocal, and we have to do something to solve this situation. That means that the response has been actually very strong. We'll come back onto that. It's probably worth bearing in mind, and again, saying that the war is a dreadful thing. However, in context, one should say that the number of civilian deaths so far has been 1,000, and we do have in total 15 wars going on globally right now. And 150,000 civilians were killed last year in these wars. Afghanistan is pretty much over now, but Taliban are doing a pretty good job of killing people there still. Yemen's still ongoing with Saudi, Ethiopia, Myanmar, Nigeria in the north, even in Mexico, and the DRC has been going for many years. So it's a difference between a war which we kind of ignore and a CNN war where we have to do something about it. Okay, let's look at the repercussions. Okay, the first order repercussions. Firstly, Russian assets collapsed. The ruble collapsed, equities collapsed, bonds collapsed. Equities are still suspended, so you can't trade those. The ruble is still trading. It went from 75 to the dollar to 135 to the dollar. It's now trading at about 100 to the dollar. So it has come back. This is bonds. So this is foreign denominated bonds. So bonds usually trade at 100, so par. And when you think they're going to default, they go to, well, in this case, 20 cents on the dollar. They've actually since recovered to about 45 to the dollar. So we're seeing some recovery in Russian assets, which is a little bit interesting to me, which suggests that the market is saying that the war is likely to be over sooner than we think, and Russia can go back to vaguely normal, if that's a thing anymore. Second thing that happened is, of course, shares came off. I think we all noticed that. The red line on this chart is the S&P 500. So the US market, sorry, this is from the point of invasion onwards. The US market actually kind of went up, kind of a safe haven. European markets, much closer to Russia, came down very sharply. Basically fell by about 10%. They've since recovered, which again gives me hope around the invasion. Third thing that happened was this: people look for safe havens. Okay, this is a remarkable chart to me. In yellow is the price of gold, and in blue is the price of Bitcoin. Okay, and look at the x-axis is 23rd of February, 24th, 25th of February. So it was in the night of the 24th of February that the invasion happened. I woke up to it on the morning of the 25th. So that moves at the point of invasion. Gold safe haven, yes. Bitcoin safe haven, no. So Bitcoin is a risk-on asset, it is not a safe haven. Gold is a safe haven. In case anyone was in any doubt on that, I know we've covered that before. But Bitcoin did serve a purpose for Ukrainians and perhaps Russians trying to store fiat currency in something safe and accessible, which is Bitcoin. So this is the number of addresses with balances over 1,000 Bitcoin, and you can see the spike on the invasion, or a couple of days afterwards. These are rich Ukrainians, rich Russians parking money in Bitcoin. So that was kind of an interesting move as well. But the real move was in commodity markets. So the world depends on Russia for very large quantities of commodities. Okay, massive oil producer, coal, gas, wheat, etc. So the price of commodities with Russia being sanctioned exploded. And this is the weekly movement in the commodity index going back to 1956. And you can see it's the largest ever by quite a long way. So pandemonium in the commodity markets. And this has big implications in terms of what sanctions are doing to us in the West. So this is coal. Let's look at the axis there. That doubled. It was going up already, let's not forget. Talked about this. Commodities are already going up. Come back onto that. Coal doubled. Nickel went insane. There was a short seller in the nickel market and got taken out. Margin called, and it was a massive debacle. The nickel market closed, but not before the nickel price tripled. Nickel is a very important component in battery power and electric vehicles. And Russia is a massive producer of nickel. Gas, we know, so gas tripled into Europe. Huge supplies from Russia, Nord Stream from the gas pipeline into Europe, suppliers of gas. And you can see this in this chart. Okay, so natural gas as a share of energy. Okay, so how much of your energy comes from gas? Italy at the top, 40% of their energy comes from gas, and half of it comes from Russia. That's the red bit. UK, 35% from gas, but only a tiny bit from Russia, so we can cut them off. Germany certainly can't. Huge dependency on Russia. And we've seen, of course, a scramble to diversify away from that for geopolitical reasons. So massive implications, which is why sanctions affect everything apart from oil and gas. So we need them. And that's another reason we do need this conflict to end and for Russia to get back to some kind of normality, because the world does depend on Russia for many things. And if we don't, then this is going to go on. So this is energy as a percentage of world GDP. Okay, rather than an important chart. When energy becomes expensive, you generally get a recession. So energy as a percentage of world GDP has gone up to 15% of world GDP is energy cost. That's a big problem. It can't be sustained at that level. We have to bring it down. Soft commodities, this is important. This is a second order effect which is going to come through soon. The price of fertilizer has gone crazy. That again has tripled. And the cost of wheat has doubled, it's come back a little bit. But the dependency of wheat of countries on wheat exports from Ukraine, huge wheat producer, and Russia, I think they produce 30% of the world's wheat, something like that. So this is bread, this is foodstuffs, this is important stuff for places like Africa. And look at this dependency in Africa. African dependence on wheat from Russia and Ukraine. All right. So at the bottom, Somalia, 100% of its wheat imports come from Russia and Ukraine. Work up from the bottom. Benin, 100% in Nigeria. Egypt, 80%. Sudan, 75%. Got the page. I mean, over half of wheat imports for most of Africa come from this region. This is a big problem. And this is going to come through as a second order effect in terms of difficulty in feeding people in the emerging economies of the world. And that's part of the trigger previously for the Arab Spring, where wheat prices got too high and people couldn't feed themselves, and there was a revolution in the Middle East. So just think about that as we go in the months ahead. Very risky thing to be doing. So we have to resolve this as soon as we can. And what it will mean is more inflation. So generally when you get a war, awful though it is, you generally should kind of look through it as an investor, because it generally doesn't last too long or have too big an effect. The thing with this one is that it's come at exactly the wrong time in the economic cycle. So we've talked about inflation already going up. We've talked about too much money in the system. We've talked about interest rates therefore having to go up. This has just exacerbated all of that. So inflation is going to be much, much higher even than we thought it was going to be because of this commodity effect. And this is one, I guess, trivial example really, but it's the price of a battery or battery cell cathode material, so a subset of a battery, the price of those components into a Tesla car. Okay, so from the top we've got lithium, we talked about nickel, and then cobalt, three core ingredients for batteries. Lithium's gone from 465, that was March 2021 to March 2022, 465 to 2444. Nickel's gone from 785 to 4750, it's probably higher than that now, given what I just said. Same for cobalt. So the cost per vehicle of this battery stuff, at the bottom there, you can see it's gone from $1,400 US to $7,400 US per vehicle. Okay, that's massive. So inflation, a big problem coming out of this. Big implication. The other big implication, and then we'll move on to the collapse of empire, is this chart or this table. Okay, you don't need to read it all. The top number is 630. Those are the forex reserves held by the Russian central bank. Okay, $630 billion of forex reserves. So central banks hold local currency and they hold foreign exchange reserves. They hold foreign exchange reserves in dollars and euros, etc. So in a crisis, they get access to foreign exchange and they can control their own currency. Every central bank in the world does it. Okay. What the Fed has done and the ECB have done is said, okay, those foreign exchange reserves, you can't have them anymore. They are frozen. They're not yours anymore, Russia. This came out 3 days after the invasion on the weekend of, I think, the 26th of February. The most, quote unquote, nuclear thing economically we could possibly have done. That's why the ruble collapsed by 30% the next day, because the central bank cannot manage its own currency. And that's a big problem. So what we've said is that for any central bank, your foreign exchange reserves, if there's a crisis and we decide to freeze them, we're just going to take them away from you. So there's no point holding dollars anymore or euros. This is the most extraordinary thing we've seen in decades, okay, in terms of the importance of the US dollar as a reserve currency. The number about halfway down that page, it says number 4, gold, 132 billion. So Russia holds $132 billion of gold in its own vaults in the Kremlin. People usually hold gold in the Bank of England in Threadneedle Street, in the basement, or in the Federal Reserve in Wall Street. And so central banks hold gold in those places. Russia has chosen to hold gold like physically by itself. A good job it did, because we'd have frozen that as well otherwise. So you're going to see a massive switch from dollars into gold. This is another reason why Western civilization is collapsing, and we've just accelerated it. And these are, I'll come back onto this, these are all central banks globally and their foreign exchange reserves. 62% are currently in dollars and 20% in euros. Okay, that's going to shift to gold. It's the only safe thing to have. So in the meantime, just to wrap up on this a little bit, markets have actually recovered since the initial shock. This is an interesting chart, I thought. So we talked about markets coming down. This shows you in green the performance of markets from invasion until their bottom, i.e. the trough, and then the in dark black, whatever those, from the trough to now, the recovery. So S&P down a bit, up a lot. NASDAQ down a bit, up a lot. European stocks down a lot, we saw that, and they've now gone up a lot. They're back to where they started pre-invasion. So markets have recovered to where they were. And you can see commodities at the bottom, natural gas up a huge amount and come back a little bit, wheat come back a little bit, etc. So markets are kind of back to where they were. So there's so much liquidity in the system that equity markets are still surviving this whole thing. So let me lead on to Western civilization collapse and kind of lead into using this kind of summary for Russia-Ukraine. Point number one, we talked previously about the Russian-Chinese-Iranian alliance. China must have known about this invasion. They haven't condemned it. They're trying to kind of support it without falling out with the States. But that's an alliance which is, I shouldn't have put a question mark, that is the new alliance. Point number one. Point number two, big Western response, we talked about that. Line in the sand, the West is trying to push back against this Eastern drive. Number three, sanctions do have an effect, but very particular on something like Russia, where you can target the oligarchs, where you can target Putin, where you can target individuals. So the sanctions are having an effect, but they won't work if China invades Taiwan. Sanctions won't really work against China as well as they have against Russia. A conflict at the worst point in the economic cycle, I've talked about that, inflation on inflation, which means higher interest rates. The Fed has already said interest rates are going to go up much faster, and we could get stagflation now. Higher inflation, lower growth, stagflation, that's a problem. And then a new world order. What the States has done, and the ECB has done, is weaponized the US dollar. So they've frozen foreign exchange reserves. They said you can't have your dollars. They've weaponized the US dollar. They've used that as a weapon against Russia, which works really well, but very short-sighted in terms of other central banks and will they hold dollars anymore. Okay, let's spend 15 minutes on Western civilization collapse, part two. Dear old Marcus Cicero, one of the greatest senators of ancient Rome. The closer the collapse of an empire, the crazier its laws. This was towards the end of the Roman Empire, I think about 120 AD, something like that. And I think we could look around maybe some COVID laws in the West, which are a little bit crazy and government controlled, and just kind of talk to that a little bit in terms of empire. But what we're really talking about is this slide I showed last time. Just to introduce this, we talked last time about declining economic strength in the States. I think that's clear compared to, again, Rome was going through the same thing. Reluctance to engage overseas. That sanctions thing has flown in the face of that a little bit, but we're not getting involved militarily, like Norway. No way the US is getting involved militarily. So the reluctance to engage overseas is still there. Declining geopolitical reach. High inequality, I'll come back onto that. Populism. Excess leisure time, I'll come back onto that. Declining tax take from the wealthy. So these factors are accentuated in terms of the social fabric by what the Fed has been doing. And the Fed has killed this, and no one's really talking about it yet. This is The End of Money. This is a book which came out, which is not a bad book. It's not a great book, to be honest, but it serves its purpose as a slide. Erosion of trust in banking, erosion of trust in money, erosion of trust in the dollar. Why is there an erosion of trust in the dollar, which is undermining Western civilization? Quantitative easing. Since the global financial crisis of 2008, the Fed has chosen to support the economy by throwing money at it. Quantitative easing is just a fancy name for money printing. Okay, this is how it works. The central bank creates money digitally, doesn't physically do it, but digitally creates more money than was there before. It buys bonds from financial institutions, i.e. banks. So banks are holding long bonds. The Fed buys the bonds off them. The bank sits there with more cash now. which they can then lend out to businesses and people to borrow more. Also, interest rates come down. Number 5, so people borrow more and they create more jobs to boost the economy. So number 1, create money. Number 2, buy the bonds. Number 3, that forces interest rates down and it adds to banks' reserves, which they can then lend. Number 4, helping businesses, people to borrow more. Number 5, they can spend more and create jobs to boost the economy. That's the mechanism. Kind of fine, but not really, because you're printing money, and that's inflationary. And also the money via the banks has ended up boosting balance sheets to the extent that all of it's hit real assets. Sorry, all of it has hit the equity market and other assets, I should say. And I'll come back onto that in a second, but let me explain first. Let's see the scale of this. This is the Fed balance sheet. You can see 2008 GFC, global financial crisis, the first asset purchase program. This is QE, quantitative easing. We're going to buy some bonds. We're going to force interest rates down. Buy bond 2008, it goes up, keeps on buying bonds. So this is the Fed balance sheet. Goes from $1 trillion to $4 trillion. And then Fed announces unlimited bond buying in response to COVID, unlimited. And the balance sheet goes from $4 trillion to $9 trillion. It's simply too much money hitting the economy at once. And what it's done, that money printing, instead of really supporting the real economy, because people kind of don't want to because they're still nervous, instead of supporting the real economy, the banks have recycled it back into other assets. Not bonds this time, but into equities. And equities have gone crazy, as we know. This is the Fed balance sheet in orange versus the S&P 500 in blue. So as the Fed balance sheet has gone up, the equity market's gone up. I'm just quite a neat chart. So, and who owns these assets? I could have done the same chart for classic cars or housing, particularly high-end housing, yachts, wine. The wealthy own those. So if you're wealthy and you're sitting there with assets, you just become a lot richer. And we've seen that in terms of the number of billionaires in the world. It's through explosion of asset growth, not real activity in the economy. So people have got an inflated view of their own wealth, and it's mostly amongst the wealthy getting wealthier. I showed this chart last time. This is the inequality problem. Last 50 years, 90% of the population, flat wages. In 50 years, this is real wages. 90% of the population flat. Top 10% doubled. And that's just income, not even wealth, which I described already. So inequality is getting worse, which is a problem for a civilization. Point number 2, excessive money and ultra low interest rates, so easy money, tends to mean that life is too easy. There's just too much money around. We've also got money in equities, so you kind of made money in equities as a normal person. Your house has gone up in value. That's not real activity. Real activity is manufacturing and creating jobs. What the Fed has done is just boosted asset prices, and everyone feels wealthier and therefore kind of work less. And again, I showed this last time. A lot less work in the West. The light greenish are the West, which is a low number of hours per week, and the East is a high number of hours per week. This is not happening in China. This is happening in the States and the decadent West. Too much easy money, less work time, and what's happened is that productivity, again I showed this last time, productivity has collapsed. Without productivity, your economy can't grow in any sustainable fashion. So the Fed is pushing asset prices up, but the real economy is not working, literally, and productivity has collapsed. The other thing too much money creates is too much money. So this is money supply in the States. So money supply M2 was growing at 23% year on year at the peak of COVID as the Fed money printing hit the economy. That is only one thing, and it is inflationary. And that money supply growth that growth in money supply has been everywhere. So in red, this is the States I've just showed. It's come back a little bit, but still growing too fast. Euro area, Japan, UK, Canada, everywhere money supply too. It's not just the Fed. ECB's the same, Japan's been the same, Canada's been the same, New Zealand, Australia have been the same. Money printing in an attempt to protect the economy from damage. And all it's done is papered over the cracks and meant asset prices have gone up, but real economic activity has not been strong enough. And what money supply does, it creates inflation. And inflation is a killer for an economy. This is US goods inflation. This is quite a startling chart. This goes back to 1969. And the 1970s were the last time we had a big inflation problem. Okay, and look at the 1970s here, 1973, 77, spike of inflation. We're getting the same spike now, 8% goods inflation in the States. Even core inflation, which the Fed loves to measure, is 6.5%. I mean, rates at 2% even, let alone 0.5% today. Rates at 2% against 6%. It's not going to work. Rates are going to go up a lot more. Inflation, big problem. And again, it's everywhere. This is the share of economies globally with inflation in excess of 5%. So the number of economies with inflation more than 5% right now. And you can see the blue is emerging economies, the red is advanced economies. And you can see well over half in total now have inflation of over 5% per annum. Big problem. And it's getting entrenched. This is the Atlanta Fed wage tracker. So wage demands are now, on a survey basis, heading towards 7%. Once wages increase, inflation gets entrenched, as we've seen in South Africa. High wages, high inflation. High wages, high inflation. That's the way it goes. It gets entrenched in the economy. And we're heading to a world where inflation is going to get entrenched at a high level and is going to be bad for everyone in the economy and in our Western civilization. And also for the markets, ultimately. So the last time this happened was in the 1970s. This chart goes back to 1881, remarkably. This is the Shiller cyclically adjusted price-earnings ratio. So a price-earnings ratio using the current price and earnings, which are normalized over 10 years. So not this year's earnings or profits, not this year's profits, but the average of the last 10 years' profits. So it normalizes the kind of up and down of profits to make a 10-year number. Price to that 10-year normalized number. That's the Shiller P. So it's quite a good gauge for how expensive markets are on a normalized basis. You can see the peak in 1999. You can see the peak now. It's coming back. And in the 70s, inflation killed that price-earnings ratio because earnings are less valuable because it's all about inflation as opposed to real activity. And the same is kind of going to happen again now. Big problem. And the other thing, the final thing, the Fed has managed to do, because I'm probably in line with this, it's allowed government debt, the amount of debt in the economy as well as the amount of money supply, to explode. Because governments can borrow at these very low interest rates, which the Fed is suppressing through QE. So governments are just borrowing all day long because they can borrow at like 1-2% instead of 5%, which is what it should be. So government debt has exploded. I love this chart. Very pretty chart. This shows you government debt to GDP. And I can assure you all these numbers today have doubled in the last decade. They've all doubled. I could have shown you that chart. I preferred this chart. Japan is the worst. It's had quantitative QE for the longest. Government debt is the highest. 257% of GDP. I've got so many questions coming in. I'm going to try and get to them. 257% of GDP in Japan. 257%. Greece on the right, 207%. Just to the right of Greece is the US, 133% of GDP. That's not sustainable. It was 60% a decade ago. So massive government debt. We've also got massive personal debt at a time when interest rates are going to be going up. So the servicing of that debt is a real problem. We've got ourselves in a very difficult situation as a Western society, as a civilization for these reasons. And the final one, then I'll take some questions. Okay, this is where the rubber hits the road for the whole thing. What do you do when you print too much of something or create too much of something? You create too much supply. It becomes worth less. What we're printing is dollars. The Fed is printing dollars. Too many dollars around means the value of a dollar should go down. However, because the US is the reserve currency, the dollar is the reserve currency of the world, held in all these foreign exchange reserves, it keeps on being strong. This is the US dollar over the last 10 years is still strong. If the US dollar stops being the reserve currency and people hold gold instead, which I expect them to, the dollar goes down. And that's the final nail in the coffin of the West, the States, Europe, the non-Asia bloc. That's the nail in the coffin of Western civilization. That's when the rubber really hits the road. And I expect that to happen possibly fairly soon. All right, those are my headlines. Question. Yesterday, an announcement was made that Russia insists on gas oil purchases being paid in rubles and no longer in dollars or euros. What effect would this have on the sanctions against Russia? Brilliant question. Thank you, Jürgen. So the next move in this is for Russia and China to price oil, which was the anchor for the dollar, because petrodollars, always bought in dollars and priced in dollars, for Russia and China to price oil in renminbi and potentially rubles. So China, I think, has already taken delivery of a barrel of oil or barrels of oil priced in renminbi. They're having those conversations with the Saudis. So you get not a petrodollar, you get a renminbi dollar. No, that's not right. A petro renminbi. So the dollar gets sidelined again. So great question. That is happening already. And it lessens the effect of sanctions because this trading bloc outside the dollar bloc, Russia, China, using not the SWIFT system, but what's called the CHIPS system, which they're already shifting to, becomes a renminbi bloc, not a dollar bloc. And again, the dollar collapses. Thank you for that tip. Since the war has dragged longer than expected, that's true so far, can this point to the possibility of World War III? Well, my wife asked me that, and I said that's the one thing I weirdly don't worry about, because I worry about things which will affect me badly, and I can kind of do something about. A, I can't do anything about that, and B, it won't affect me badly, it'll finish me. So we're all dead if that happens. So it sounds a bit glib, but I really don't concern myself with that in terms of bandwidth. Could it happen? Gee, I'm not sure. What I will say is that Putin is, in my opinion, not mad, and it's entirely rational. If you look at his press conferences pre-invasion, a number of years before invasion, he was very clear about the NATO expansion, the reneging on the agreement, and the reason why he would invade Ukraine. It's very logical, and he's protecting his borders in the same way we would. The war is awful to look at, and any war is awful to look at, but it doesn't mean he's mad. And he's intensely rational and very logical, and at the moment, very angry. So not being mad reduces the likelihood of him pressing the button. Being angry increases the likelihood of him pressing the button. So I don't know is the answer. We will see. If I was a betting man, I would say not. And I do think we'll get a negotiated settlement because that will save Putin, because he can claim victory. He can claim Ukraine's been demilitarized because he's crushed them. He can claim that they will not join NATO. Ukraine have already said they won't join NATO. So he can claim victory. That was the main thing he wanted going into this. And he can claim, if Ukraine will give it to him, those Eastern Russian separatist blocs as part of the deal, as well as the annexation of Crimea being cemented. So Putin can walk away with a victory here, as well as Zelensky can, because he's defended Ukraine. They're a neutral country. They're a strong country. So you could see how a win-win could work. I might take one more. Which crypto do you think the sanctions will be less effective on Russia? The impact of China helping Russia in the background, reducing the effectiveness of sanctions on Russia. China, I'm sure, it is helping Russia in the background. They're trying to be very careful about it. It is reducing the effect of sanctions. That's, in effect, a bigger risk that China gets dragged into this from the US point of view. That's a bigger risk of a broader conflict, in my view. And I very much hope that doesn't happen, and I hope the conflict is resolved, and I think it will be before that happens. So, in summary, I'm expecting the conflict to be resolved with a negotiated settlement, I hope within the next 2 weeks. I think Russia will go back to kind of normalized-ish relations because we need their commodities, and that will solve the commodity problem, which is exacerbating the inflation problem. The inflation problem is not going to go away. It's going to be bad news for most people. Interest rates are going to go up a lot more. And where that lands in terms of Western civilization is we've got social fabric declining. We've got too much leisure time. We've got too much decadence. The Fed has printed too much money, which has hit the economy in massive scale and has inflated the value of assets as opposed to real economic growth. And that has made people richer, and therefore we've got a more unequal society. And they finally said, you can't hold the dollar anymore as a central bank because we will take it away from you. That is the final nail, which will reduce the value of the US dollar as a reserve currency. and shift the world's focus from the US as the core of the trading bloc and a petrodollar to China and the renminbi as the trading bloc and the petro renminbi. And that shift from west to east has just been accelerated, as I've been talking about for the last couple of months. It's just been accelerated by this conflict and by the decision by the Fed and the ECB on the central banks to say, your dollars aren't good anymore. You can use your own stuff. So not good news, I'm afraid, not a cheery webinar, but we will watch with interest. And in the meantime, I wish you the very best of luck through this tricky period and hope for better times ahead. Thanks very much. Oh, and there is an opportunity within all of this, which I mustn't forget. Of course, as money shifts out of dollars by central banks, they will buy gold. Now, central banks own around $12 trillion of assets, and gold in total is valued at $12 trillion. So if central banks do switch from dollars into gold, the opportunity is that the gold price will probably go up. So amidst all this melee within your multi-asset portfolio, having some gold, I would suggest is probably quite a good idea. Want to leave you with that. Thank you.